thank you for having me here. It's a personal privilege and pleasure to be introduced by Mark, who is one of the great public servants of our time. We've had a chance to work together through two periods during the Clinton administration, both when I served at the State Department under Secretary Christopher and then when I moved over to the White House. And Mark may tell you that the deputy has an important job, but I'll tell you the Undersecretary for Political Affairs has a really important job, and Mark was a great one and a real reflection of the best in our Foreign Service, which is a really, I think, somewhat underappreciated treasure of our national capacity. And as we work together now with Secretary Clinton on what we call our quadrennial diplomacy and development review, the appreciation that we have gained for the role that our career foreign service and civil service play, I think, has only grown as we begin to think about the capacities the United States needs to meet the challenges of the 21st century. So I want to salute Mark and his many colleagues in the Foreign Service. And I'm especially pleased to be here with you from the World Affairs Councils of America. I was telling Lori, I think over the course of my career, which has included a few political campaigns, I've spoken to probably about half of the World Affairs Councils in the world. I remember one of my earliest outings to Ottumwa, Iowa, during the 1988 presidential campaign. But it really is a reflection of the fact that while we have important national organizations that lead the discussion around our country on key areas of foreign policy and national security, it's the grassroots organizations like yourselves that involve citizenry in these debates, and it allows us, the people, to be well informed and focus on the issues that may be a little bit not obvious from their day-to-day lives, but which obviously affect their day-to-day lives, that you play such an important service. And that's why it's such a privilege for me to be here with you. And I think it's especially important right now. You know, I've not surprisingly gotten a lot of questions in the last 48 hours about the recent elections and its impact on foreign policy. I'm convinced that we have a very strong bipartisan basis for the conduct of foreign policy in this country and American leadership, and I know that the Secretary and the President and I and everybody else looks forward to working with the new Congress to sustain that bipartisanship. But precisely because, frankly, we didn't have that much discussion about foreign policy and national security issues during the campaign, it's all the more important outside the political season that we continue a vigorous and engaged debate of our citizenry. And again, I thank you for the role that you play in that. I think it's important to use this opportunity to reflect on some of the core challenges that we're facing. This morning I'm going to focus on East Asia because the President and the Secretary are both deeply engaged right now in that issue. But I want to begin with just a few broader observations. In this month's Foreign Affairs magazine, which I know most of you do read, is kind of some people read Sports Illustrated and others of us read Foreign Affairs. The Secretary has an article, and she begins with an observation. She said, today's world is a crucible of challenges testing American leadership. Global problems, from violent extremism to worldwide recession to climate change to poverty, demand collective solutions, even as power in the world becomes more diffuse. They require effective international cooperation, even as that becomes harder to achieve. And they cannot be solved unless a nation is willing to accept the responsibility of mobilizing action. And the United States is that nation. And I think it's particularly important to reflect about the world in which we live and the changes that have taken place in recent years. And nothing illustrates that more vividly than the recent very troubling and scary incident we've had with these two package bombs coming out of Yemen. Because they illustrate the deep conundrum of our times, which is that on the one hand we have benefited enormously from the progress of globalization and the interdependence that comes with it, the opportunities for economic growth, for increased exchange among people, for sharing ideas and experiences, of overcoming differences and isolation that those forces bring, but also the very forces that bring us closer together also facilitate the forces that would try to undo and damage these structures and the way of life in which we live. And there's just nothing that illustrates that more vividly than the continued attacks on our transportation system and the fact that we use this for human exchange, for our increasingly interconnected globalized economy and the like. And it really illustrates, as I say, the twin dilemmas of our time, which is that our fates are increasingly tied together, and therefore we need common action to try to address these problems. But at the same time, although no one nation alone can solve these problems, without leadership it will be impossible to galvanize the kind of response that we need to meet the changes of our time. The changes that not only focus on issues like terrorism and non-proliferation, but also the new challenges like climate change and global pandemic disease and piracy, all of which require an increased level of common activity. And this is something I think that we need to focus our efforts on. How do we generate the capacity in the international system to be able to meet these challenges? And in our own efforts, we've identified 3 core elements of a strategy going forward about how to mobilize that sense of common or collective action. First, beginning with our traditional alliances and partners. From this hemisphere, where we are deepening our ties with Canada and Mexico. I myself just came back from a visit to Mexico, and where, despite the very serious challenges that Mexico faces and our common effort to deal with the problems of transnational criminal organizations and drug trafficking, our increased and deepened ties, I think, give us a sense that we will and are determined to deal with these challenges together. To our partnerships with Europe, which, although we hear less about transatlantic relations, it's precisely because they are in such good form and because we have such steep bonds of interest and values that allow us to work together not only on challenges in our area, in the transatlantic area, but beyond, as illustrated by our common efforts on the global economic crisis, on issues like the Iranian nuclear program, where the United States and Europe are cooperating ever more closely to deal with a serious challenge. And we will see this on display this next month when NATO holds its summit in Lisbon, followed in the same city by the US-EU summit, in which we will reaffirm the centrality of our transatlantic alliance for the 21st century with a new strategic concept and a new way forward that will allow us to deal with the challenges of the 21st century, both through NATO and through the US-EU. But also with our traditional allies in East Asia, and I'll come back to that. So that's the core of the strategy. But it is just the stepping off point, because as we all recognize, and you recognize very well, that in addition to these traditional allies, there are new powers arising around the world, which offer enormous opportunities for the United States to develop new relationships and new partnerships to meet these common challenges. And we have to develop the kinds of relationships with these emerging powers that will allow us to make sure that their role in the system is one that strengthens our capacity rather than weakens the ability to meet what we believe are largely shared challenges. And these, of course, are the emerging powers ranging from India and China to Russia's new role, to Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia, and so many others. And beyond these, and the nation states are still quite critical to the core of our international system, we need to go beyond these relationships with traditional allies and emerging powers to develop the international structures of cooperation, the multilateral cooperation that we need to bring people together to deal with these common challenges, both on the regional and the global level, by strengthening regional institutions, by strengthening the UN and the other global institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, and others. We will increase our capacity to deal with the challenges of our time. And as I said, nowhere is the set of challenges more obvious than in East Asia, where we have this mix of these 3 elements very much in play. Traditional allies, emerging powers, and new efforts to develop multilateral cooperation. And over the coming days, indeed over the past several days, these forces and this strategy will be very much on display. As we gather here today, Secretary Clinton is wrapping up her 6th trip to Asia in less than 2 years as Secretary of State. You may recall her very first trip as Secretary of State was to Asia. And on this trip, she's visited Vietnam, Cambodia, Malaysia, Papua New Guinea, New Zealand, Australia, and even a brief stop in China. And in a very short period of time, the President will be on his way to India, beginning a trip to India, Indonesia, Japan, and Korea which reflects, again, his strong commitment and the administration's strong commitment to building ties in this region. And just as a final footnote on that, I too am leaving on Monday to represent the United States in the APEC Ministerial in Japan this coming week. So we are very focused on this, not to say that the other regions of the world are not sustained importance to us, but there's no doubt that the forces at work in our world today makes East Asia critical to our own long-term security and prosperity. The economic dynamism, the increased focus on capacity to meet challenges like nonproliferation and terrorism, disease, and climate, all make Asia a critical set of challenges for us. And opportunities, I think, are really quite enormous there if we both sustain our engagement and show leadership in working with the countries of the region to meet that. And again, here you can go through the three core elements of our strategy. First, our traditional allies. Our relationship with Japan, I think, is really quite a remarkable one, and we have seen, and I think it's important to reflect back over what's happened in the 60 years of our alliance, or even further back from the end of World War II, and the transformation of Japan to a modern, democratic, open society, which is partnering with the United States on economic, political, social, in transnational and security issues. We're working very hard to make sure that that alliance remains vibrant and relevant to the 21st century. And through our common efforts to redefine the ways in which we work together on the security front, the ways we work together in global institutions, I'm confident that relationship is going to remain vibrant and a cornerstone of our engagement in East Asia. But we've also seen, I think, in recent years, a tremendous deepening of our relationship with the Republic of Korea. Another remarkable story. If you think about what the situation was in South Korea in 1960 and the level of poverty and the lack of political opportunity in that system, and now we see a country which is not only a vibrant democracy and one of the most successful economies, now having joined the ranks of the G20, hosting the G20 summit, but also playing a role in the region and globally. It will be hosting the second Nuclear Security Summit. It's partnering with us in Afghanistan. It's playing a critical role in so many of the issues around the world. And we're really enormously appreciative of the leadership of President Lee Myung-bak and his administration in demonstrating that Korea is moving from a country that was a consumer of security to one that's helping to provide security to others. In Australia, another steadfast part of our sustained alliance partnerships, we're celebrating the 60th anniversary of that alliance. There's no more reliable partner for the United States and no country that we appreciate more for its own contributions to security in its own region and also globally, again, in Afghanistan and around the world. We work together in a relationship of confidence and of shared values and interest, which is really unparalleled. But we also have important new partners in the region. The increased importance and attention we play to the countries of Southeast Asia, the ASEAN countries, which includes two of our traditional treaty allies, Thailand and the Philippines, which remain strong partners of the United States, but also other both long-term friends and friends with whom we are developing even stronger relations, like Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. And all of these relationships will be on display both during the Secretary's trip and the President's trip as well. And of course, beyond these allied and traditional partner relationships, we have the two most significant emerging countries in the world in this region, India and China. And I think it's really significant to take an opportunity to reflect on the role that India is playing both in the region and globally today, and the importance that we attach to building this bilateral relationship between the United States and India. As many of you know, the first state visit that the President hosted was President Singh, and over the time since President Obama has been in office, that relationship has only grown closer. India is demonstrated over the last 2 decades that it's ready to play an increasingly important on the global economic and political stage, a country that is experiencing sustained 8% economic growth, where U.S. exports to India have quadrupled in goods over the last 7 years and tripled in services during roughly the same period of time. India, the second largest increasing increase in investment in the United States now of our global partners, and again, a critical international partner now with us in the G20. But also, our relationship spans a whole range of activities in the economic, political, security, and human dimension. I've said in the past that we are entering what I call the third stage of our renewed relationship with India that began with President Clinton's historic visit to India in 2000, that took an important step forward in President Bush's decision to move forward on nuclear cooperation, civilian nuclear cooperation with India. But now we're in the third stage that puts us into orbit, in which we broaden that relationship to go beyond specific issues to a comprehensive partnership reflected in the U.S.-India strategic dialogue, and the many issues that will be on display during the President's visit, including cooperation on education and technology, on agriculture, not only to help build a second green revolution in India, but also for us to work together to help meet the agriculture and food needs of other countries, particularly in Africa. And of course, the enormously strong people-to-people relationship that we have with India. And it's significant that this is the first stop of the President's trip into East Asia, because India is not only obviously a central player in its own region of South Asia, but is very much an East Asian country as well, participating with us in the East Asia Summit and increasingly engaged with its partners in East Asia, as the recent meetings between Prime Minister Khan of Japan and Prime Minister Singh so amply illustrate. And it's not coincidental, therefore, that we have seen an increase in our security engagement with India. It's now true that for India, the United States is the country that it has the most military exercises with. We've deepened our security partnership in many ways, and it's something that I think contributes broadly to the security of the region as a whole. So we welcome India's increasing role in the region and see it as a partner there. Now, of course, the second and obviously equally important part of our challenge in dealing with new systemic powers is our engagement with China. As you all know, in this past year, China surpassed Japan as the world's second largest economy, and it passed Germany as the world's largest exporter. And on almost all of the global issues of our time, as well as the regional issues, China has an important role to play, and if it can play a constructive role, has an important contribution to make, which is why this past May, we sent one of the largest U.S. delegations ever to participate in the second strategic and economic dialogue that was co-chaired on our side by Secretaries Clinton and Secretary Geithner. As Secretary Clinton has said, and I'm quoting her, "In the 21st century, it is not in anyone's interest for the United States and China to see each other as adversaries." And if you look back, in fact, our engagement has led to some important achievements, including President Hu's participation in the Nuclear Security Summit here in Washington, and China's support for new UN sanctions against both North Korea and Iran. And while the path getting there was not an easy one, China did sign on to the Copenhagen Climate Change Treaty, which provides a platform for us to begin to address this urgent question of global climate change. And yet we recognize that as we seek this relationship of increased cooperation and pursuit of common interests with China, we recognize that there will continue to be areas of disagreement, especially as China's economic growth is accompanied by increased capacity on its military. And it's important that we find increased avenues of dialogue to address these challenges. It's what the academics, some of the people who will be on your panel next, call the security dilemma. As countries become more capable military, there's an inherent risk that will come into conflict. And the only way in which we can address that challenge is through dialogue. And in particular, the importance of strengthening military ties between the United States and China. And we welcome the fact that China has invited Secretary Gates to come to China to begin to put that on a stronger footing, because we do think it's critical to our future. It's important to recognize that military-to-military ties are not a favor that one side gives to the other or bargaining chip. It allows both sides to prevent miscalculation and allow ways to understand our common objectives and achievements, particularly on sensitive issues like the LOC and the South China Sea, as well as the need to address issues beyond the military dimension. and the increased importance of our ability to talk through our different perspectives and our differences on human rights and the rule of law. And I was happy to be able to welcome the Chinese delegation for our human rights dialogue here to Washington a few months past. And it's important that we continue to be able to address our differences candidly, whether it's about the condition of political dissidents like Liu Xiaobao, or the broader question of openness and the opportunities for the freedom of expression and religion in Chinese society. So these are big challenges. How do we sustain our traditional relationships with our allies and build them to make them 21st century relationships, and also deal with these new emerging powers? As I said, in East Asia, perhaps more than in any other part of the world, the nation state does still remain the core of the center of activity and the way in which we need to build up our efforts to meet these challenges. But that alone, I think, is going to be insufficient. And that's why we have focused on this third element of our strategy, which is building new institutions and structures of multilateral cooperation to enhance cooperation, to allow us to work more effectively together. And East Asia presents a real challenge in that respect, because historically East Asia has lagged behind other parts of the world in building the kinds of institutions. There's been a reluctance to move towards more formal institutions that can really tackle the hard problems of our time. But I think we're seeing now, and have seen over the past decade or so, an increased realization that we do need to work hard to build these structures to complement the bilateral relationships. And if you look over the past year or two, you can see both through our own decision to join the ASEAN Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, to Secretary Clinton's participation in 2 ASEAN regional forums since she became secretary, Secretary Gates' recent participation in the ASEAN Defense Ministers meeting, and now most recently Secretary Clinton's visit to Hanoi, where she participated for the first time in the East Asia Summit, is a prelude to our expectation that the President will join next year in this important new and emerging institution, as well as our continued commitment to APEC, both this year in Japan, where I will participate at the ministerial level, and then the President will join the leaders a few days after, and the anticipation as we move from the Japanese chair of APEC to next year, in which we will host APEC in Hawaii, and an opportunity to demonstrate that APEC can be a cutting-edge instrument to sustain and deepen economic cooperation, increase trade and investment, and particularly the ability to deal with the new challenges like dealing with regulatory standards and promoting green technologies and trade and investment in green technologies. These all represent important opportunities for us to deal with common challenges. But we also see it in more flexible and innovative tools like the Mekong initiative that we began with our partners in Southeast Asia to address some of the environmental and economic challenges of the countries united by the Mekong River Valley, to our efforts to work together through our dialogue on the North Korea problem and others, are all examples of how we are trying to find new strategies of multilateral cooperation in East Asia. Now, of course, how this is all going to come out remains uncertain, but the one thing we do know is that the prospects for a peaceful and stable East Asia that benefits all of the peoples, both in East Asia and across the Pacific, depends on our engagement there, and that's why we have placed such a high priority on it, and why we look forward to building constructive relations with all the countries of the region. And I think while the engagement doesn't guarantee success, in the absence of that, we would have little chance of achieving the goals that are so important for all of our people throughout the United States, as well as our partners in the region. So thank you for listening to me today, and I look forward to your comments and questions. Do we have mics? Yes, we have mics. Go ahead, please.
Can you all hear? It's on now? Okay. I'm Diane Jacobson from Jacksonville, Florida. Thank you for your comments. The underwriting theme here has been that our nation can't be strong if our economy is not strong. And this morning we attended a breakfast on information technology. And at that breakfast, we basically heard that while the United States is very good at negotiating trade agreements, we might not be so good at enforcing those agreements. The result of which is that China and Korea and Vietnam and a variety of other countries Number one insists that we build manufacturing facilities in order to have access to their markets, which is not exactly free trade, and that more importantly, that our technology is either being reverse engineered or outright stolen. And we don't seem to have a mechanism to enforce that because we bring suits in their courts, and of course we lose because it's not a level playing field. So my question is, number one, is that true? If it is true, what do we do about it? Because it dramatically affects our economic security and our national security.
I don't want to, sorry, here we go. I don't want to underestimate the challenges of enforcing trade agreements, particularly the multilateral trade agreements, but I wouldn't share that basic assessment. I think that, on the contrary, that what we're seeing is, one, an increased emphasis on rules-based trade, and a recognition by many countries who in the past have perhaps been scofflaws in the international trade system, that it actually in their own long-term interest to see strengthening of the rule of law and trade as they begin to move up the value chain, that they need to understand that it's in their interest to protect intellectual property, that they need to observe their own commitments. We're very determined to vigorously enforce our trade laws and the commitments that our partners have made in the WTO. You'll have noticed in recent years we've filed a number of cases involving countries including China most recently, and we will vigorously enforce them. That's a priority for the President. He's made the expansion of U.S. exports a priority for us, and we recognize that we are confident that we can compete if the playing field is level and rules are observed, and we will take every advantage of the rights that we have both under bilateral agreements and multilateral agreements. But we also, I think, engage, in addition to the kind of rules-based enforcement, on a sustained engagement with our partner countries about why their own strengthening of their own laws and their own commitment and their own enforcement will be critical to their own future. And I believe that we will see progress in that area. We see this in our dialogue with China, with India, and with others. We have to be vigilant, but I think that in the long run there is increased recognition that countries will not be able to sustain their own economic growth through piracy or through means that would make it other countries less willing to deal with them. So we're very alert and very attentive to these problems. We devote considerable resources to it, but I think that this is something that's not a long-term losing proposition for us, and I think that we have the better argument when it comes to this, and I believe through our engagement we will continue to make progress.
Karen DeBartolome from the Denver World Affairs Council is not on. Got a green light. I'll shout. Our mayor this summer hosted the Biennial of the Americas. Now our mayor's our governor. Our state is very interested in relationships with Latin America, and I noticed that you didn't speak to Latin America in your talk. I wonder if you could address that part of the world and the other left behind continent, Africa.
Well, I got to say, you know, it's every time you give a speech, if you pick one thing to talk about, you immediately get accused of neglecting the other, and I plead guilty. But I just came back from Latin America, my second trip to Colombia and to Mexico, and so I'm not apologetic in the sense that I think we have a very, very deep engagement with Latin America. I actually, though I didn't participate in the meeting that you described, I was in Aspen for a meeting right afterwards with a number of the former heads of state in Latin America, including President Toledo, who is an old friend, and heard a little bit about the meeting that you described. This is an enormously important region for the United States. One of the, again, if you think about, I mentioned the first trip of the secretaries was to Asia, but the first meeting that the president had with any head was a meeting with President Calderon. Actually, it's just even before the inauguration, President Obama's inauguration. And we've had very sustained and high-level engagement with Mexico. The president participated in the Summit of the Americas just a few months after taking the presidency. The secretaries twice participated in OAS meetings. We've had extensive travel to the region. We've had a number of the key leaders of the region in the United States. The president just met with the newly elected president of Colombia, President Santos, in New York during the General Assembly. I, as I said, was just in Colombia for my second visit, and the president had a chance to talk with the newly elected president of Brazil just a few days ago. So we see enormous opportunities and a real, I think, a transformative environment in Latin America. And what is significant about that is that we believe there's an opportunity in this region not only to work together on common challenges, but to learn from each other. That it's not just a question of the United States telling others what to do, but a recognition that we're all dealing with common problems, and how we deal with creating economic opportunity and social inclusion throughout the hemisphere. And so our Pathways to Prosperity program, for example, is a way in which we share ideas about creating economic opportunity. How we learn from programs like Brazil's Bolsa Familia or the Oportunidades program in Mexico to create jobs and economic opportunity for those who are less well off. How we work together on dealing with the problems of transnational criminal organization and drugs. How we create an opportunity to deal with the energy challenges of this hemisphere, and particularly in the area of green and renewable energy, where there's tremendous capacity in this hemisphere to show that we can chart a new path in that dimension. And what is encouraging about it is that there is a tremendous convergence of interests in the hemisphere. I mean, one of the reasons why you don't see too much in the headlines is because we don't have enormous clashes. We have, rhetorical differences with a few of the leaders in the region, but there is not a deep debate in this region about the centrality of democracy, about the need to have our economies be open and grow. We have opportunities to build and strengthen those partnerships both on the bilateral and regional level, but I am very optimistic from my own engagement, in a sense that we have strong partners, that we're working together to deal with bilateral and regional problems, but we're also working together on a global stage. And the fact that countries like Mexico and Brazil and Argentina participate in global institutions like the G20, the fact that Mexico will be hosting the next round of the Conference of Parties on Climate Change in Cancun, the participation of Mexico most recently in the Security Council, and Colombia now joining the Security Council, are all examples of deep engagement that we have with this hemisphere. And so we do understand the importance, and it is something that's very, I think, resonant with the people of this country to understand the need to have strong throughout this hemisphere.
One last question.
Okay, great.
Thank you. My name is George Pate. I'm with the World Affairs Forum in Steinberg, Connecticut. First of all, thank you for a very impressive overview. I'm always amazed at people at your level keeping these things straight. In the course of yesterday, we had a reminder from one of the speakers that strategy is a question of making choices. And in the course of yesterday, there were some areas of choice either expressed or heavily implied. The first was a question Ian Bremmer put to Tony Blair, talking about global economic governance in concert with countries with different values, namely China. And the question is, which of our values would we have to compromise, adapt, or otherwise manage in order to have peaceful, orderly economic governance? And I think the flip side might be, what of our economic interests might we be willing to put at risk for the sake of our values? Second area has to do with security. We heard a lot of new areas that are becoming security concerns. We heard one expression that said, hey, some of this we're going to have to absorb. And so there's a question there, again, of priorities and choices. Which are those areas that we would actually devote resources to, and which might we have to absorb? Now, I ask these two questions in light of two perspectives. I was a Foreign Service officer, political tone, for a number of years, and to be perfectly honest, I wonder at our government's institutional ability to analyze questions of that nature. Which means that and because of that, I suspect and I'm quoting somebody, I forget